So are the speakers up for it? Yeah? Okay, great. Then, as I am the chair, I will stay here. You've said it?
It's the only file that's not in folder.
I am delighted and honored to open the first plenary session after our taste of ODR in action. We're starting some more of the talking part, and this session is entitled ODR and the Emerging Online Justice System, New Institutions, New Processes, and New Perspectives, sort of laying out the stage of what's out there and where we're headed, give us a taste of the next 2 days. And we have a very impressive panel with us. I would like to start off, unless people have preferences, I thought of starting off with you, Colin, then Salil, Guy, and end up with Ethan, add a few of my own comments, and then open it up for conversations and questions, and hopefully we'll have enough time for discussion, so please jot ahead the questions while you're listening. Okay.
Lorna, we've dynamically rearranged ourselves because Salil's already set up here. So
Perfect. So Salil starts.
Okay,
No problem.
And
I think use this version. Show. How do you do show on this one? I don't. I have 90. I still have 2003.
Just click down here.
Oh yeah.
That link right there. There you go.
The new version's getting. Oh, okay. It should be good. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone here at Haifa for hosting this. I'm very honored to be part of this plenary session, and everyone has been very nice. And also thanks to Neva, who gave me some really helpful comments on an earlier version. And to the extent that any of you have seen an earlier version, this has changed a little bit. But since the fall, if you had actually read it then, and it was available online. So there's been a shift in emphasis. So I should explain what we're doing, or what we've done here, which is that, first of all, Wikipedia has an arbitration system. Some of you may have known that. If you didn't, that's the first thing to sort of gather, is there's an arbitration system, right? And we wanted to test a few themes. Together with I should mention I have a co-author, my colleague David Hoffman, also at Temple. One of them, the original simplest thing we wanted to test was the idea that although theoretically Wikipedia is about creating an encyclopedia and capturing content, that the arbitration system was not about content. That actually turns out to be the easiest thing to show. But the other things we wanted to think about was sort of the mechanism by which people work together on Wikipedia in terms of how this arbitration system deals with conduct and what it does to deal with that conduct, bad conduct, good conduct, what have you. And so Wikipedia is of course this poster child for social production. I mean, most famously in Yochai Benkler's book, but others have written about it too, and have really stressed how there's this incredible ability for people to participate, to realize their altruistic or non-monetary impulses, the whole idea of the internet lowering the barriers to doing that, that's not actually our focus, right? We accept that there is this altruistic impulse, and it has become easier to realize. Our focus instead is more on why they can actually cooperate, right? Because these are people who do not actually fit sort of the Robert Aleckson order without law paradigm. They don't live in a community that is organic, that they have to be sort of locked into. And more importantly, how do they actually cooperate? That's our biggest focus. Not only why do they cooperate, but how can they possibly do it, since they're going to have inherent disagreements. If you think, and by disagreements, what I mean is, if you think about the Wikipedia project, the idea of a level of conflict is really kind of built into the DNA of the site. If you think about what the wikis look like, and unfortunately I don't have a page up, but think about any Wikipedia page, and you go, most of you have seen, all of you have probably seen the Wikipedia, almost all of you have probably looked at a discussion page, and if it's anything that's at all controversial, you'll see the back and forth between the editors. Actually, you'll see it even if it's something that's not particularly controversial, right? And so built into this idea is this kind of, built into the site is this kind of idea that truth is going to emerge from this kind of dialectical discussion, right? So conflict is built in. So the question is, how are these people able to cooperate? And the existing theories we found were not very specific on the mechanism, and that's not necessarily their fault. That wasn't their focus, right? Their focus was more like, this is amazing. These people aren't being paid, and they've generated, they're capturing as much of their version of human knowledge as they can. But what could be doing this, right? People have pointed to norms, because Wikipedia is actually very good at promoting sort of PR about its own norms, particularly the idea of objective writing. Right? The idea that people are going to have a neutral point of view. Perhaps there's another norm out there that they promote a lot, that there's a kind of buy-in by the community into the project. Right? Could it be law? There's not really legal cases in the sort of black letter sense. We think that there's something like law that's emerged, and there is some relationship between law and norms here, although I'm not sure we capture exactly what's happening. We are focusing more on this mechanism of what this system they've set up does. And so many of you may be familiar with the structure of Wikipedia, but the basic idea here is it's very large, right? I don't know in this slide if it's that readable, but so you've got 13 million total registered total pages. You've got 17 million users. Most of them don't actually edit very most of them don't actually edit very actively. And so you've got, it boils down to 1,500 administrators. That's still a lot of people with the power to block people temporarily or do various things. To get 1,500 people on one page is not easy. And then there's smaller numbers of other people, culminating with the founder, Jimmy Wales, who still holds a certain kind of individual power, right? And so that's the basic structure, and it is a nonprofit foundation that holds the ownership of the site. Actually, I should say sites. We focus on English, but obviously there are many other sites. So the basic sense is that what we want to point out is that arbitration exists at sort of the culmination of failures, right? If there's a dispute resolution system and you only get to the arbitration point if you've failed at various levels. So, right, as I mentioned, the wiki has this kind of conflict built in, right, the actual discussion page behind a Wikipedia entry. And so maybe people resolve their dispute at the page level, right? They figure a way to get along. Or they can, if they can't, they seek comment from other users and try to develop some sort of consensus based on that input. Further on, they can seek mediation, which is non-binding and is based on traditional methods of mediation. And finally, they have set up an arbitration system. I'll talk a little bit about what that is. So what they did is essentially they borrowed, and the paper goes into more detail, they borrowed from some elements in AAA, the American Arbitration Association set up, and then they changed them a lot, right? And so essentially they set up a committee of arbitrators who were elected on a kind of approval basis. You had people who had a certain amount of experience in the community got to vote to approve a slate, and then Wales, the founder, would pick people from that slate to be part of the 12 arbitrators. This is actually in flux now, so they may change this system. But when they set up the arbitration system, there was actually, and we looked at the discussions among the people involved, because again, they preserve these archives. There's actually quite a bit of sort of tension among them, because they, not unlike I think a lot of groups on the internet, just kind of subscribe to this idea that they could self-govern without rules and law. Right? We've seen this sort of techno-libertarianism before. Additionally, beyond techno-libertarianism, they also had a kind of tension because they had a kind of techno-communitarianism going on. They thought that they, that if they could all get along and buy into a consensus, they wouldn't need this kind of law, right? And so there were concerns about, and they still use this term, wiki lawyering. People getting too technical in the dispute resolution system, acting like lawyers. That would be bad, right? But they started to bargain in the shadow of law. When I say that, and the paper talks a little bit about this, they sometimes bargained in the shadow of what they wrongly perceived the law to be. For example, they thought in their discussions that you could get sued for having inaccurate statements about facts, right? You could get sued, but you probably aren't liable, right, under American law, unless you really go wrongfully off the charts. They also thought that somehow if they had an arbitration system, that would create, and then they got sued later, that would create some sort of stronger position for them before an actual, publicly funded judge. It's not clear that's true either, but they bargain in the shadow of these perceptions. There was some resistance, fears that it would be slow, that it would dominate the energy of the site, that it would get them bogged down into something like law, essentially, or what they perceived to be the failures of law. But they did it anyway, right? And so here's an example of an arbitration committee, a segment of an arbitration committee opinion. So basically what happens is when the arbitration committee gets a complaint, they create something that looks very much like a kind of an internet version of a legal decision. First, there's a set of first is the description of who complained, right? So it starts off not unlike a civil complaint, and then it turns into something very criminal justice-like. So first there's whoever complained and what they complained about. Then they have a statement of principles, right? Not statement of laws, but principles, where they start to list the principles that they think are relevant to this decision, right? And then there are findings of fact, and then finally there's a list of enforcement acts, or what will be done to the violator or violators. Some of these cases have more than one violator who's dealt with. On each of the findings of facts and on the enforcement, the arbitrators vote. Now, so you actually get a record of who voted for what. And so what we did here was we actually only looked at the things that they voted, did this point go ahead or not? We didn't say, okay, 7-1, or this, this particular arbitrator looks this way, because there's only, we really were focusing on the end result of punishment and the and what kind of conduct drew punishment. So here's an example of someone who gets banned from Wikipedia for a year because they are not an objective. They're not an objective editor. In fact, they go beyond that. They actually seem like they're not valuing the site, right? They view it as a soapbox to push a point of view, but as a kind of an advocate in a political way. And and this is the sort of thing we wanted to test, is to what extent Wikipedia is looking for people who can discuss without becoming partisans, essentially. Another example is a more garden variety, sort of antisocial behavior example, personal attacks. Just making attacks on an individual, just saying bad things about them. Some of them can be based on, it could be based on gender or race or ethnic identity or what have you. Others could just be, sort of stalking this person online. Everywhere they go, you show up and you say nasty things about them, right? You can get banned for that too. So the other sort of simple idea is that they have to exclude some people. Some people are just really bad. So the question is, what do they really exclude for? Are they excluding for bad editing, or are they excluding for bad conduct, or are they doing other things with respect to content? These are the kinds of questions we wanted to look at. So what we did was we looked at starting in early 2006, the arbitration system actually started in late 05, but in early 06, they actually not only had arbitrations, they had a reporter. In other words, they had clerks, volunteer clerks, who boiled down the decisions into a reporter, which was then circulated in the community, which made these cases sort of public. And we cut off the data set in early 07, because when we were doing this work in late 07 and early 08, that gave us cases that were basically all finished. So we didn't have the problem of cases of having to take out a lot of cases because they were not concluded. So we did have to wind up, out of the 283 cases, we did drop 16. 11 of them alone were just because the cases were never finally decided due to cited lack of evidence. So we don't have a huge problem, it seems like, with selection bias, but we get 267 cases. I should also mention that any time there's a complaint, almost no cases, when you have a complaint, you get a decision. We don't have a lot of problem that way. To the extent that there is selection bias in the system, I think our problem would be that people may never bring certain cases. And I think that's one of those problems you deal with. So violations of neutral point of view, which is their term of art for objective editing, other things like that. And so we created a kind of a language, or we distilled a language that they were using, and wound up with over 30 different types of violations. In this stage, and after doing this, we found out that there were almost no cases in which the arbitration committee ruled on the truth of a fact. In other words, they're not about content. So that hypothesis we got rid of pretty quickly, as we confirmed that. So we have these cases. So what we wanted to do, though, was think about how conduct relates to punishment. So this is just an overview of the remedies that could happen in these cases. And the reason they add up to more than 267 is because sometimes you have multiple parties. Sometimes you have the same party receiving multiple remedies or multiple punishments. And as you can see, the most common punishment is caution or probation, right? Which you might think is a relatively soft remedy. But you still have a decent number of total bans from Wikipedia, and somewhat more bans from particular subjects. In other words, you're banned from writing about, George W. Bush or something, but you can participate otherwise on the site, or an article ban, right? So you could write about the Bush administration, but you can't write about Dick Cheney or something like that, right? So we get this. The harshest punishment is the total ban, right? And so we want to think, how does this work? Well, what we did a regression, and the regression table's in the paper. But one way to sort of express what the regression tells you is using a software package and statistical package called Clarify, which says, okay, in a typical case, knowing what we know about the regression data, what kind of probabilities do we see if we had the average case out of the 267 for these remedies? Well, it turns out, right, that again, in the typical case, you've got a 63% probability of a caution or probation. The least likely, you've got a 15.7% case of Wikipedia ban. And when I say a typical case, this would be a case that has sort of the average amount of bad editing and the average amount of antisocial behavior, right? So it's a case that doesn't really exist. You've created this average. And the brackets show you the 95% confidence interval, which is why this is prettier. So as you can see, this just sort of reiterates this idea that cautions are more common. Well, the biggest finding, or I think our most important finding, is that if you looked at each of these should probably say only. So here's your probability of getting banned. If you only had an editing violation, in other words, if you only did bad editing, your probability of getting banned is only 6.3%. This, we thought, was sort of in tension with the idea that the site is governed by these sort of objective editing norms. That's not to say those aren't important. I think those norms are important. But the arbitration system is not necessarily about banning or punishing people who violate that norm. Instead, interestingly enough, right, you actually are much more likely to get banned if you have impersonation, that's like sock puppetry, or antisocial behavior, either like only by themselves or together, right? If you have those and you also have an editing violation, that would be the average case, because in an average case, you have the average probability of antisocial behavior, the average probability of impersonation, and the average probability of having an editing violation. In the average case, you're actually less likely to get banned, and we find that where you have impersonation and antisocial behavior and you also have an editing violation, you're actually less likely to get banned than if you have impersonation and antisocial behavior by themselves. So our hypothesis, or our conclusion, or our theory, is to explain this by thinking about kind of weeding in and weeding out, right? That even though you're a bad editor, in other words, you're transgressing certain norms, bad editing shows a certain level of commitment, and they need editors, right? So that they look for other remedies, these cautionary remedies, mentorships, etc., for bad editing, and even bad editing can even help kind of excuse these other examples of bad conduct, particularly impersonation, antisocial behavior, by showing that you have a commitment to the site. So what we conclude is that this system of dispute resolution is trying to attempt to make this conflict constitutive. It's actually trying to figure a way to channel it back in and weed in people who could be useful to the community and weed out people who are not useful, do not seem to show hallmarks of being valuable to the community. And so that's sort of interesting because of the notion of Wikipedia as a commons. That's, I think, partially right, that they're solving this prisoner's dilemma, but that's not I think the whole function. There's also a coordination problem, or a coordination game, if you like game theory, in that they're trying to find an equilibrium where they bring in people who have matching levels of commitment and matching levels of commitment to these norms. And so there's that as well. So that represents the weeding out would be kicking out the people who would destroy the commons, right? The weeding in is figuring a way to keep the people who can be coordinated into working productively on the project, even though they might have moments of bad editing. So in a lot of ways, this starts to mirror some of the things you think about with criminal justice, things like rehabilitation, whether people are useful contributors in other ways apart from their transgressions. We think the editing norm is still relevant. It's just not the focus of the arbitration committee. It seems to be honored in the breach, right? And then finally, one thing one might wonder is, well, these are 267 cases over a year and a half. That's not a huge number given the number of people. We were later told, once we had posted this paper, we got a bunch of qualitative, sort of discussions that were pointed to by a bunch of administrators in Wikipedia, that this system is not as important today as it was 2 years ago during the period we were studying. And they said the reason is that a lot of these cases actually became the subject of discussion and became sort of jumping off points for the creation of policies. So now you see some policies after this period that kind of enshrine what these decisions were distilling. So in a way, there's this two-way direction relationship between this system and the norms that they try to govern themselves by. And so at the final sort of takeaway from this, I think, as a lesson, is that this turns out to be both a kind of a useful, an optimistic sort of thing to look at, and something that maybe is not replicable. Optimistic because I think it's important to remember that these people have created this system voluntarily, and it's fairly elaborate in some of the things it does, and in terms of its transparency and its record keeping. However, the one thing that I have to keep coming back to when we think about this is they're so committed to this context and the situation of dialectic and discussion and conflict that they can commit to trying to manage it and make it constitutive. And we're not sure. And again, this would be something to think about in the future. We're not sure how easily that kind of commitment can be achieved elsewhere. So, I look forward to your comments.
All right, there we go. Well, that was a fascinating presentation. I couldn't help but sit here and refine some of my comments on the basis of that, and I'm sure that the other two panelists are going to react to mine as well. I think it's much more interesting to make this a conversation between the four panelists, and we have a lot of time to chew on that. I'm eager to get your input, too. I feel a little selfish coming in right now because I'm sure lots of you have questions about the Wikipedia model. But it is interesting for me. I'm coming off 5.5 years working in the eBay, PayPal environment, and I feel like I've learned a lot. You know, I wrote a book about online dispute resolution before I got to eBay, and now every time I open that book, I cringe a little bit because I think I had done about 1,000 disputes by the time I'd written that book, and now I've, have been exposed to many, many more systems. I wish I could go back and do an edition too. So I don't know, Ethan, if you have any pull with Jazzy Bass, maybe they can let me do another edition. But a lot of the thinking that I feel that I've refined over the time that I've been at eBay, I've tried to put into this deck. And I think a lot of it gets to the points I think that was just raised, thinking about the Wikipedia example. So this is a broad topic, the emerging justice system, but I wanted to focus in particular on the notion of online community. Now, this is something, I spent a lot of time interacting at eBay at PayPal with MBAs. I don't know if we have that many MBAs, and I don't even know if they're called MBAs here in Israel, business-focused individuals, people who are focused on profit and loss. These are the kinds of people that shareholders like to put in charge of large corporations in the United States to maximize the return. Now, the challenge with MBAs is that they think about opportunities in a very particular way. And my background is actually not from a business perspective. My background is in public policy. My practice area before I got into online dispute resolution was multi-party public disputes. So I'm actually what we call an MPP. And I focus mainly on looking on public structures. So if you look at Wikipedia, which I think is a great first example, it's very difficult for an MBA to understand Wikipedia. What is the profit model for Wikipedia? I'm not sure if there is a profit model for Wikipedia. I think Jimmy Wales has tried very hard to find a profit model for Wikipedia, and he has not been able to figure one out. I think Linux is another good example. And there are plenty of examples out there. I know I have many friends at Facebook. Facebook is trying very hard to find a profit model, and pretty much all they can come up with is advertising. However, the users understand the value proposition of Facebook. The users understand the value proposition of Linux and Wikipedia. So when you have an MBA mentality and you're trying to figure out all of these emerging online institutions, it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around it. And the more time I spend at eBay, the more I feel the way to understand these online phenomena is not to think about them from the standpoint of Adam Smith. It's to think about them from the standpoint of John Locke. When I am thinking about, am I going to be part of one of these websites? I'm saying, what's the value that accrues to me by participating within them? And once I'm in there and I'm a member of this community, what right do I have to shape it? And if they violate their social contract with me, do I have the ability to leave? Now, online citizenship, I've said at many of these meetings in the past that if you counted up all of the users of eBay, we would be the 5th largest country in the world, which is a nice tagline. But of course, most of those people don't feel any connection to eBay near the association that they feel with a national entity. I mean, I see all the national pride here in Israel. I don't see a lot of eBay flags flying around on people's houses, It's just the way it goes. And the other thing is people can be citizens of 1,000 online countries. I can be part of Facebook, and I can be part of MySpace, and I can be part of LinkedIn. It's not exclusive. So it makes it very easy for me to say, you know what, I'm sick and tired of Facebook, I'm gone. Hang up, never log in again. And eBay has a lot of people that have done that. They've gotten so frustrated for one reason or another, or maybe their attention moved someplace else, they stopped logging in. But what we have found at eBay is this centrality of trust. Trust is the number one most important thing online in terms of, especially e-commerce, but I think if you look at some of these other models that are not commercial models, still trust becomes very important. Wikipedia is about trust. It's not just about that your money is going to get you your item. It's that the information that's there is trustworthy. And the reason why Wikipedia is putting so much energy into all of this is because they know that if they don't invest in the trustworthiness of their mechanism, it's all going to fall through their hands like sand. Another very big thing that's happening in many of these communities is reputation. Reputation is a huge thing at eBay. People care about their reputation. What is your feedback? Did you get positive feedback? And if the institution that monitors or manages this community goes in and starts unilaterally descoring feedback or changing feedback, then the entire trust infrastructure of that reputation system falls apart. And then what you see is people start to leave because they don't trust it. So we spent a lot of time talking about dispute resolution. I'm from the dispute resolution field, but I feel like there's a bigger word that we all dance around in this field that we don't really talk about, but I'm starting to think a lot more about, which is justice. And we have a lot of law professors in the audience who know a lot more about justice than I do. But I feel like if I talk to customers at eBay, I talk about redress, but what they're saying back to me is justice, justice, justice. We want fairness. So when we talk about institutions, I think that concept is very important. Now, online justice. Online dispute resolution is very transaction-based. I'm going to talk in a minute about some lessons that we've learned in the face-to-face dispute resolution field. And we have giants here in the audience like Carrie's been thinking about this for a long, long time. So I'm not going to presume that I'm the expert here, but I just want to name some things and then hopefully spark a conversation. Fundamentally, if you look at what's happening, and in Silicon Valley, maybe this is a little more apparent than it is. I mean, Israel is essentially close to Silicon Valley. Haifa is the Silicon Valley of Israel, I was told yesterday. So our lives are moving online. There is no question that this is true. If you look at the younger generation, maybe if, I don't know, you think on an abstract percentage basis, how much of their lives exists in the electronic ether? For many of us, it's maybe 5%, 10%, 20%. I work at a high-tech company. My wife makes fun of me. I work on a computer all day. I come home, the first thing I do is get on the computer. So maybe 50% of my life is online. We are seeing a huge change in what it means to be a person. Now, online dispute resolution, online redress, online justice is part of this institution building. As we shift our lives into this new sphere, as it's been referred to, we need to have these structures in place to help people work out their problems. I don't think that we in this field have thought adequately about what that means to be an institution, part of this new institution that we're moving towards. We've been very transactional in our focus. E-commerce e-commerce appeals to the MBA in me because it does focus on transactions. But when you look at social networking, which really in many respects is supplanting e-commerce as the dominant application online, you start to see many more of these questions, these difficult to answer questions emerge. Who runs things? Where does power reside? Who owns what we're making here jointly, all of us together? Who owns this, and what can they do with it? And how does law relate to all of this? I think e-commerce has been really the engine in ODR for a long time. And in some ways, it's overly simplified the questions that we should be asking ourselves. And if you look at where technology is heading, there are much harder questions there that we need to wrestle with. So I'm not going to presume to answer these things, but I'm going to ask them to all of us because I'd like them to think about them jointly. All right, let me speak briefly about some of the limits of the ADR field. And again, I'm speaking very much from a North American context. I understand there's a global alternative dispute resolution movement, and many countries are in very different phases of their development of ADR. But in the United States, I would presume to say that we've reached a bit of a crisis in terms of thinking, what is the ADR field, and where are we going? Some of the aspects of this crisis are, one, we are very focused on mediation. Mediation has become the focus of ADR. Now, ADR has been defined as everything that's not the court system. And if you think about that, that's huge. There are millions of possibilities. But we've, in the ADR field in the U.S., have focused down pretty much on one function, which is mediation. There's a lot of discussion. Are we a field or are we a discipline? Can you be a professional dispute resolution person? We've tried to certify people to say, you are a certified mediator, and it's impossible. We've been doing it for decades. We can't figure out how to do that because we can't figure out what does it mean to be a mediator. What skills should you have? Much of the good work that's being done in the ADR field is being done by non-professionals. People that have never had a mediation training, they don't know what mediation even means. They think it means meditation. They hear resolution, they think New Year's. You know, that's the way, but they're great at dispute resolution. So what do you do with these people? And there are also people out there who've been doing dispute resolution for a very long time, and then you see what they're doing, and you, whoa, wait a minute. You know, I don't know if that's really great. So that's a hard thing to wrestle with. The other thing is the dispute resolution field has long, this has been talked about for decades, has operated in the shadow of the law. And I think we have flattered ourselves to think that we were kind of wrestling with this institution and helping to redefine it, which I think is true. We have to a certain degree. But increasingly, our field has been co-opted by the legal field. The Association for Conflict Resolution, which is the premier professional organization for dispute resolution professionals, has had a lot of struggles recently. However, the American Bar Association dispute resolution section is growing by leaps and bounds. And again, Carrie, I don't mean, there are a lot of lawyers in the audience. I don't mean to alienate anyone. But the persistence of the legal model and the legal frame continues to be a huge challenge in the dispute resolution field. Now, why do I raise all of this? Because I think that ODR is very clearly an inheritor to the ADR field. And I think that we have inherited many of these cognitive frames and many of the same vulnerabilities that the ADR field is wrestling with. So, several of you have seen my model for ADR before, so I'm just going to briefly put it up here, not dwell on it too much. But you can see the different building blocks of ODR are very similar to the different building blocks of ADR. You see negotiation, you see mediation, you see evaluation. I think that in ODR we have a much stronger claim to the initial stage of problem diagnosis, but I'm not going to get into that too much here. And a lot of us have talked in the dispute resolution field about the movement from non-binding facilitative processes to binding processes. Now, what we often see in the ODR field is the use of many of these building blocks in conjunction to act like filters to resolve disputes as much upstream as possible. So what you can see is, looking at this model, we really are thinking from the same standpoint as the ADR field, the alternative dispute resolution field. We're just trying to bring that online. And I think that we've seen that there's some things that technology enable us to do in dispute resolution that is impractical, if not impossible, in the face-to-face world. And we've innovated within ODR to create these new tools. But we have not fully grasped the scope of possibility that technology provides ODR. And we have settled into certain frames for thinking about how ODR works that I think are hindering our ability to move forward. So how am I doing on time, Lorna? Okay, good. Another few minutes. I can talk about this all day. Ethan, do you want to give me your session? I know you don't really have anything to say. Okay, good. And I want there to be time for conversation here, so I only have a couple more slides. But I think online dispute resolution as well, we have become overly focused on mediation and arbitration. That has become something, when we think about ODR, we are thinking about, well, how can we deliver these services more effectively through technology? And again, that was a problem in the ADR field. I think it's a problem we need to break out of in the ODR field. Because fundamentally, when you talk to our clients, they aren't just looking for mediation and arbitration. They're looking for many other things. The other thing is our focus on disputes. I remember in the early days of this field, we spent a lot of time talking about what should we call ourselves. And we decided to be ODR, I think partially because we did want to grow out of the core of ADR thought and research. We were very proud of the fact that we used the AAA Spider standards as our standards in ODR, because we didn't want to say we were creating this from whole cloth. But at the same time, disputes has been an albatross around the neck of the dispute resolution field. Because many of the things that people wrestle with, they resist definition as being disputes. Ethan and I just attended a meeting in Washington, D.C. I really feel like the use of the word disputes was the primary hurdle to all these people understanding the value that our field had to bring. Because they did not want to define the issues that they were trying to get resolved as disputes. So to say, well, let's bring in the online dispute resolution field, they're like, wait a minute. I don't know if these are disputes. So we're very focused on that language. Third of all, we've come up with certain calcified models for ODR practice, one of which is blind bidding. Blind bidding was invented in 1999, and I think it's very exciting. I mean, I don't want to speak for CyberCycle, who I know is in the audience. They've done a lot in terms of innovating and pushing the model of blind bidding, but it has been around relatively unchanged for quite a long period of time. The same thing is true with third-party mediation and arbitration. I ran an online dispute resolution startup in 1999. We have far more advanced implementations of that, including the online arbitration court we saw this morning, including JuraPax, including many of the companies in the audience. But fundamentally, it's still operating the same way. Look at technology. Look at how technology has evolved in the last 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, there are things we could do now we couldn't even conceive of back in '99. Why is it that we are still trying to provide the same services that we came up with almost 10 years ago? The other thing is, I feel like in the dispute resolution field, we often tell people what they want. We say, look, I know that you say you want this. You want your Perry Mason day in court. But what you really want is this wonderful process that I understand and that I've come up with. And you may not understand, but I'll walk you through it. And I think that is very short-sighted. I think that we oftentimes have customers say, well, you think that you know what I want better than I know what I want, and I disagree with that, so I'm going to go someplace else. We also see the people that go through our processes oftentimes show no greater likelihood to use them in the future, even though they've gone through them. That's not a good sign. If you have someone use your process, they should say, wow, that was great, and next time they need to be much more willing to use it. Finally, insensitivity to evolving needs and expectations of parties on the internet, and an inability to deliver services at acceptable costs. We all want disputants to want to pay $100 per case. But the fact is, it doesn't look like for e-commerce disputes. How about I say that? If it's a IP dispute for $500,000, maybe they'll pay a lot more than that. But our parties have shown incredible resistance to paying us the amount of money that we think we deserve for these services. And we've never really fully come to terms with that. So again, I only have a certain amount of time. I don't want to go into really bearing my soul here. I don't want to start weeping on the podium. I don't know if that's, this is a UN meeting. We should all maintain our decorum. But this has been a real struggle at eBay and PayPal. There is a fight for the soul of online dispute resolution within this company. And it's not been made public yet, but I think very soon it will be made public. There is a fight between the marketers and the dispute resolvers. There is a fight between the advocates of fairness and justice. That's me. I wish I had a big S on my chest or a big E or something. And the advocates of customer service. The advocates of the buyer is always right. There is a big move at eBay to say it doesn't matter if the buyer is right or wrong. It doesn't matter what the fair outcome is. The fact is we need this buyer. And if they have a problem, we're going to take care of them. That is, I think, antithetical to a lot of the values that make up this field. So we need to think about what is the role of justice in that environment. And I'm happy to talk more about that if we want to get into it. But I think it was this case study that really brought me to many of these realizations. So let me just wrap this up because I know we have two other panelists. I think we need to think about expanding the definition of ODR, reconceptualizing our field. Yes, we have a lot of innovations and value that we have hatched in this field that we have yet to communicate to the world. I don't mean to say we need to slow down our advocacy, but at the same time, we need to be much more customer-focused. We need to be more client-focused. That is the only way that we can figure out the path forward. Because fundamentally, and this is a lesson that eBay has learned that I agree with, it is the people who are going to pay for these services that need to have an opportunity to define what these services are. So I think that's true, and it needs to be by sector. We need to look at commercial arbitration, e-commerce, community management. Each of these sectors has very different needs. So we can't come up with one third-party solution and expect it to be a panacea in all contexts. We need to retool our language. We need to rethink this focus on disputes. Let's think about focusing on the positive, resolutions on issues. That's what people want is solutions. They don't want somebody to tell them, oh, well, you're unable to resolve this yourself. Increasing flexibility, decreasing rigidity, technological advances. Our field should be moving at the pace of technological advance. We should be integrating some of these new technologies, and I don't see us doing it. Part of it's a resource constraint, but I think also part of it is us patting each other on the back about the way ODR works and not willing to put in the long nights necessary to ride that wave. Another thing, I was speaking with my friend Chitu about this yesterday. We need to really focus on the needs of the developing world. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the developed world, but the real opportunities and the real value of dispute resolution, much like Skype, a company that eBay owns, exist in places where these infrastructures don't exist. So we need to definitely, and I know I'm looking at Jeff Oresti, who's been great at pushing this particular part of the agenda. That needs to be a big part of our effort here, is focusing on those communities. And I also am looking at my friend Dan in the audience who works in the public context. I think that there are a lot of different issues associated with introducing online dispute resolution in public fora as opposed to private fora. So we need to be specific there too. So my belief is ODR is core to the creation of these new institutions. We need to start talking about justice. We need to think about changing our language so it's more client-focused. We need to give our customers, the people that are not experts in this area, the ability to help define the field so that we aren't just going out there and trying to tell people what's good for them. And we need to ride the advances in technology. I personally believe, based on all the struggles that the alternative dispute resolution field is experiencing, I feel like ODR may be the future of the alternative dispute resolution field, because we are young enough and we're nimble enough to make the changes that are necessary to matter moving ahead. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily true with the broader field. So as all of our lives move online, ODR becomes less of a niche service and becomes mainly, it becomes a mainstream service. So I think that we need to answer these questions in order to deliver on the overall promise of ADR. So that's it. Thank you.
my PowerPoint?
Is your thumb drive in?
You're waiting as if I have so much to say. I'll just begin by saying that. What do you connect this one to? 0.1. Procedural rules for ODRs. One may expect that when people engage in building their own new substantial legal regimes, they would also attempt to set up their own rules for settling disputes in a manner which is much more attentive to their own unique collaborative normative compass. So I made a very brief and very initial inquiry, and my general observation is that overall the collaborative nature of cultural production and sharing norms is not reflected in dispute resolution between participants, and here are just a few examples. Take, for example, the GNU GPL license or the Creative Commons license. There is no reference to dispute resolution. All disputes between licensors and licensees, between those who provide content subordinated to the Creative Commons license or those who use content which is governed by the Creative Commons license, all those disputes are basically channeled to the general state judiciary system, and the question is whether this system is capable of being attentive to the ideological background, to the values that underlie those collaborative frameworks for producing and distributing content. Wikipedia, Salil already gave an excellent description of the dispute resolution mechanisms. So we have informal mediation, a mediation committee, and then an arbitration committee. Now, it is true that the people who sit on those committees are being elected in a way which is at least somehow democratic, but at the end of the day, these are all top-down mechanisms that have no collaborative participatory reflections in the way they decide upon disputes. Moving toward the commercial edge, commercial intermediaries which function as frameworks for content sharing platforms for social networks. Again, overall, if you look at YouTube and Flickr, there's no reference to dispute resolution. Moreover, throughout its proprietary control, YouTube has the sole discretion to decide upon removal issues and other disputes between users. Same thing goes for Second Life and for Facebook. Linden Lab has the right, but not the obligation, to decide upon disputes between users if within the virtual community. Facebook Facebook has the right. Facebook has the right, but not the obligation, to decide upon disputes between users as for materials on the platform. So, generally speaking, we can observe that there is a gap between the collaborative nature of platforms and the manner in which disputes are being resolved. Mostly disputes are being resolved in the usual traditional legal structure, either through the general judiciary system or throughout the imposition of proprietary contractual restrictions. There's no strong sense of collaboration and participation in building up the rules for settling disputes and then in determining the norms through which disputes will be decided upon. And I think that two questions arise. The first question is, why has such a structure evolved? The second question is, should it be changed? Why is such a structure evolved? I think there's no one straightforward answer that is unilateral to all the examples that I gave. As for proprietary platforms such as YouTube and Facebook, it seems only natural that those commercial platforms want to preserve their control and avoid any external interference. There are also many possible market failures that deal with users' lack of incentive to battle over ODR issues, especially when we speak about platforms that have a strong network effect with a lock-in element that prevents users from migrating to other platforms. It should be mentioned that Facebook has several recent developments, for example, regarding its IP policy that exemplify the fact that at times users may have an impact on building up the internal legal norms of the community, and maybe a long time these impacts will also have some influence on the way disputes between users are being handled. As for the Creative Commons license and the GPL license, I think that here it's quite harder to explain why those licenses have no reference to the issue of dispute resolution, because I think the founders, those who established those licenses, should have been aware of the fact that courts will have limitations in taking into account and adopting the values, the sharing norms that underlie those licenses. Regarding Wikipedia, I think the question is much more complicated, and to some degree it goes back to Salil's lecture. I think it eventually, at the end of the day, it is a question, how do we decide upon the boundaries of truth? If Wikipedia understanding of truth is as one objective truth, the traditional conception of, for example, historical truthfulness, then maybe top-down mechanisms are indeed the right way to determine disputes between users. Yet, if our understanding of truth is much more relativist, much more minded of subjective elements, of collaborative mechanisms in structuring narratives about truth, then maybe participatory and collaborative elements should be taken into account when someone determines the boundaries of legitimacy within the community of Wikipedia. Looking ahead, I think that one observation that I came up with is that those who are involved in collaborative cultural production, those who are involved in setting the rules for collaborative cultural production, should pay more ex-ante attention to the issue of dispute resolution. Now, before finalizing, I must emphasize that I'm perfectly aware of the fact that there are significant differences between the various examples that I just mentioned. I'm also not sure, I'm quite sure that there isn't any one type of unilateral mechanism for incorporating collaborative and participatory elements into dispute resolution. I can also speculate that the degree of those elements would vary from one type of platform to another. YouTube is still a commercial entity. To some degree, it will work differently than the Creative Commons license, yet one puzzle still remains. There is a strong gap between the collaborative nature of those platforms. At times, also, their tendency to collaborate in creating new substantial legal norms, and on the other extreme edge, the fact that at the end of the day, dispute resolutions are mostly left to the traditional legal system. Thank you.
Okay. Well, for the second time, I'm extremely pleased to be here. I thought I would be able, as the person going last, to say something insightful about the various themes that were raised earlier, and I'm really at a loss. Perhaps Orna can provide some sense of consistency here. But I think one of the themes might be the one I mentioned earlier, that we don't really have to work very hard to generate disputes. Applications described as collaborative somehow end up being full of disputes. And Tim Berners-Lee, the designer of the World Wide Web, wrote in his book recently, "My motivation was to make sure the web became what I'd originally intended it to be, a universal medium for sharing information." Well, I think he should have realized that a lot more was going to happen than simply sharing information. And the more creative we are in using information or communicating information, or most importantly, processing information, the more disputes we are going to have. And I think if we're patient, the more need we will have for online dispute resolution, and the more creativity we will find in responding to disputes. The idea of wikis, well, wikis are a different form of using information. The new deputy director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Beth Novak, is the author of a book published just a month ago called Wiki Government. She wrote that book before she was in the government, and will be interesting to find out how her ideas play out. One of the things that we know about the new Obama administration is that it believes technology is a solution to many problems, and Mr. Obama is definitely the president we have had who is most familiar with the use of technology and clearly a believer in technology. And I thought this morning I would talk about one of these initiatives that's a very high priority and that raises all of these issues of how we use technology creatively, but how at the same time we pay more attention than perhaps some of these entities that were just referred to, how we pay more attention in advance to contemplating the resolution of disputes and how disputes are likely to be generated. This is a particularly important initiative because it's not a private initiative, it's a governmental initiative. It has to do with the development of electronic medical records and the use of electronic medical records in the United States. There are probably many of you from different countries in which patients have electronic medical records. In the U.S., it's somewhat rare. Health costs are extremely high. Use of electronic records is extremely low, and the Obama administration is planning to devote or allocate almost $20 billion so that over the next 3 to 4 years, the use of electronic medical records will increase. It sounds like a wonderful idea. It has the potential, it's being sold as having the potential to improve health care. After all, if I need to see a physician here for some reason, that physician here should somehow be able to have access to my medical record located in the States. $20 billion these days is also intended to put a lot of people to work, and there's a great need, given the economy, to put people to work. So this is the thought. We have the technology, we'll use the web, we'll create applications, and it's done in other countries, and we will have improved health care, increased employment, and all kinds of other benefits. It's usually described simply as moving paper files to electronic form, and most of the money is actually going to be devoted to doctors' offices. Doctors' offices are the weak link in the current scheme. So when individuals go to the doctor, their files are in paper form. When the doctor gets reimbursed by the insurance company, well, that's handled electronically. Pharmacies that are paid by insurance companies, well, that's handled electronically. And a fair number of hospitals have invested in various forms of electronic records. Very little of this is connected, but the weak link, it's currently thought, are the doctor's offices. Can I get my bottle of water? I could use a drink. That's fine. Well, is this true? So this idea we're being sold that this is a movement from paper records to simple paper records to electronic records, from paper to electronic form. In the United States, most individuals have never looked at their medical records. I'm curious about practices in other countries, but I confess to being unfamiliar with those practices. In the U.S., it's rather peculiar, but when one visits a physician's office and one is waiting in the waiting room, it's almost, I think it's universally true that the manila folder, the paper file, is never, you're never left alone with it. You could, of course, and you even have a legal right to look at it, but most of us never do. So we don't know what's inside. We don't know if the information is accurate. or not. And we don't really know how it's used. And in a sense, don't really care that much because it's assumed to be the exclusive domain of the doctor. What happens when you move that kind of document or file to electronic form? Well, I think, unfortunately, the administration is assuming that you're just taking the data, you're scanning the data, and you're moving it to electronic form, and basically information is information. On the other hand, the new electronic records are actually nothing like the paper records. And we run into problems over and over again when our language is limited. And I think these are not really, the paper files are something, and the electronic files are something. But to use the word record suggests that they're the same thing, and they're not the same thing at all. The paper files are in these folders. The electronic files are actually composite files. So you have the file information from the hospital, you have information from various doctors. It's all in one place, and if I have a few minutes left to me, I'll show you an example of this. And then the data starts moving around. And the data moves to the insurance company, and data moves to pharmacies, and patients want to hold this data, and patients have access to this data. So when I said before I've never seen my paper file, I have seen my electronic file, and I keep thinking that's odd because I've had a paper file since I was born, and I never looked at it, and I've only had an electronic file for a couple of years, and I'm privileged to have an electronic file. Most citizens don't. It happens to be a result of where I live. But I've looked at my electronic file much more than I've looked at my paper file. Because it's accessible to me, and it tells me that when everybody has electronic files, their behavior is going to be different, and their concerns over the information in these things is going to be different. And one of the things we're going to find is that we have problems with the information we find, because we're going to see that it's not accurate, and it may be used in ways that are problematic for us. So let me give you a couple of more concrete examples. One is a news story that was in the Boston Globe, my local newspaper, a couple of weeks ago. Well, actually, it's this story. This gentleman, Dave DeBronkart, happens to work in the technology industry, so he has his own electronic file, and the hospital system he belongs to, which is the hospital system I belong to, decided that it would collaborate again, maybe the wrong term, that it would participate in a system with Google Health and Microsoft. Microsoft and Google Health have their own system of electronic medical records. It's free. Anybody can use it. Their process was based on the idea that individuals would provide the data. So their system originally was intended to be something like a paper file in which I might have written down all my prescriptions, all my medications, whatever else I might need to tell a doctor that I couldn't remember myself. It turned out this wasn't really one of Google's great ideas because people don't like to enter data, or people have trouble entering data accurately. So Google decided, well, it could get all the data that exists in other places, and the places they exist are hospitals and those systems that have electronic medical records. So this individual, Mr. DeBronkart, clicked on the box of his medical record that said he could send his data to Google Health, or they would send his data to Google Health. And then Google Health would have also a composite information. He provided information shipped over from the hospital system, and that would be a more useful record. Well, what happened? Probably can't see this, but he was told the following. Google told him that Mr. de Brancard had already had kidney cancer. Google told him that his cancer had spread to either his brain or his spine, a frightening diagnosis de Brancard had never gotten from his doctors, and listed an array of other conditions that he never had as far as he knew, like chronic lung disease, aortic aneurysm. A warning announced his blood pressure medication required immediate attention. Well, it turned out like none of this was true. It's a bit complicated, but what happened was that the hospital sent over the data, the information that it had sent to the insurance company in order to get paid. And these weren't diagnoses by doctors about his health. These were diagnoses used in order to get the physicians compensated. That's not really fraud. That's simply the way current practices are. Might sound like fraud. The problem, the real reason it's not fraudulent is that there are not enough codes. There are more procedures and processes, medical processes, than there are codes. Well, there happen to be about 10,000 codes. You would think that would cover it, but it turns out it doesn't, and that contributes to another problem. Again, we're in the process of using new information in new ways. So these 10,000 codes, which don't cover all diagnoses and treatments, and therefore doctors find the closest one, the World Health Organization and the U.S. government and other governments have already done this. But in the U.S. it will be adopted over the next 2 years, a new series of codes, 150,000 of them. So how can you have a system with 150,000 codes in which you can have trust? I think that's another theme that's come up here. Trust in the accuracy of the information. If you don't have trust in the accuracy of the information, what value is this information? So I don't think anybody will have trust in their medical records unless there are systems for dispute resolution. So tell me when I'm running out of time, but I'd like to show you my own record, which is the same system Mr. de Brancard uses, and it's very simple. You sign in here, and you end up here. And on the right side, you can see that Beth Israel Deaconess has partnered with Microsoft Health Vault. I could do that if I want to. I'm not sure I do. And if I want to look at my records, and the first time I did this, the only reason I developed an interest in this is that I looked at my own record, and I didn't really care for what I found. So we're live here. So I'm fairly healthy. Otherwise, I wouldn't show this to you. And this is, in terms of the layout and the interface, it's relatively primitive. But basically, this is a listing of my visits over a 10-year period to the emergency room. Broke my rib, burned my hand. Went to Romania. Why these are all in the same place. Got some shots when I went to Romania. None of this bothered me, but then said on February 22nd, 1999, I had an anxiety disorder. I might have had anxiety. I frequently have anxiety, but anxiety disorder, no, I don't know what that was doing there. And it bothered me, and it still bothers me. And if it were in the paper record again, I would never know about it. But this bothers me for all kinds of reasons, because this data is moving around. I may not send it to Google Health, but they're sending it to the insurance company. The insurance company is sending it to other people. There are categories of businesses. You create these electronic medical records. Well, what really is happening is you're creating a valuable new information market of information about treatments. And sometimes it may not be identified, the patient may not be identified, but the data is out there, and it's all being used lawfully. So I decided, well, I'd like to get this removed. And as you can see here, there's no place to click to ask to get anything removed. And it turns out in the United States it's actually against the law to delete information from a medical record. That has to do with preserving accurate records. It's clearly a remnant of paper, because you could do it other ways, and eventually they will do it other ways. So I asked the overseer, I asked this doctor how many disputes this system had. He said, well, we don't have any disputes. I said, well, possibly that's because there's no way to complain about problems. And as a result of interactions we've had recently, they are actually going to put a button on these things that will allow people to complain. Mr. de Bronkhart, who has all kinds of problems, one problem he didn't need was to have on his record a statement when an x-ray was taken that it was an x-ray of a 53-year-old female. Mr. de Bronkhart was more persistent than I am, and he decided he needed to fix that. And he couldn't fix it, but the hospital system did put at the bottom, this person is not a female. The problem with all of this is how information is used. And we have to be very careful about how information is used. Because once it's in electronic form, we should be paying a lot more attention to anticipating consequences of its use. But even if we do pay attention to it, this is, entrepreneurs want to use information in an innovative fashion. And innovation means that we haven't thought about it. The Web 2.0 phenomenon, in which entities, the value of entities is based on the value contributed by users, well, that's innovative, and that makes a lot of sense, but it generates conflicts. eBay, I was interested to hear Collins say that these other entities, Web 2.0 entities, don't have good business models. eBay has the world's best business model, or at least originally it did. Its original business model was, we'll provide a space for buyers and sellers to come together, and we'll assume no responsibility if anything goes wrong. We just take our few cents or few shekels whenever a transaction occurs. Well, that's a wonderful business model. Second Life doesn't resolve disputes because Second Life doesn't want to be responsible or liable, because if it undertook to settle disputes, then it has the same business model. We'll provide this virtual world, and we're not responsible for anything that happens. Well, eventually that disclaimer of responsibility doesn't work perfectly, but it works for a while. In any event, I think we're in an age in which we're using information creatively. Our current administration is focused on using technology in novel ways, that inevitably is going to generate more attention given to disputes, and I think inevitably it will give more attention to the field of ODR. So, thank you very much.
Okay, I realize I've been a very relaxed chair up until now, so now I need to actually do something. I feel we have been very fortunate to have these rich and insightful presentations open our deliberations today. And indeed, the mix of systems, dispute types, topics raised in these 4 presentations provides an excellent introduction to the evolution of ODR and the relationship between ODR and the traditional dispute resolution processes Colin raised. And I'd like, can everyone hear me now? I'd like to address these issues by revisiting really, I think, 2 of the most basic questions we can think of. Revisiting the scope of ODR, really what ODR is, and the functions of ODR, what does it do, and underscore the ways in which these 2 questions, or the answers to these 2 questions, have evolved in the last few years, and possibly chartering some ideas for the future. So I'll start with the scope question. And the conventional understanding of ODR is that it represents ADR plus, right? ADR online, on the internet. And I think one of the major questions that has come up in all discussions is, does this understanding actually reflect what ODR is today and where it is headed? And I'll explore this from 2 perspectives. One is the online part, and the other is the ADR part. I'll start with the online. Is ODR necessarily linked to the online environment? And I think, on the one hand, it's no coincidence that both eBay and Wikipedia are represented here. These successful and popular websites are also leaders in the field of ODR. In both circumstances, the formal legal system and traditional ADR processes are typically unavailable or really impracticable. Now, eBay was a pioneer in realizing the significance of dispute resolution systems for enhancing user trust in the community they established, developed these unique, tailored, automated processes, and were smart enough to hire an in-house director, right, to design and oversee these operations. So while eBay is a commercial site, albeit one that sees itself as a community, Wikipedia is a not-for-profit project that draws on the users, as we've heard, to generate the world's largest online open encyclopedia. So Wikipedia introduced its dispute resolution system in 2003, and this seems to be following the significant growth in its user base, and maybe grounded in what Guy said in a broader ideological framework. Indeed, both eBay and Wikipedia are classic domains for ODR, right? They resolve disputes that arise online from online interaction between distant parties, typically strangers. Over the years, and these forums actually supply good opportunity to sort of see where we're at, I think if we look at the programs of these different forums over the years, I think our understanding of what ODR actually is has evolved, has broadened. Increasingly, we come to view ODR as being not only about resolving disputes that arose online through the internet, but also about managing, resolving, preventing conflict, whether it arose off or online, with the aid of technology, not necessarily online. And I think that is where Ethan's presentation takes us to this, new frontiers for ODR through the realm of digital medical records. Now, under this broader understanding of ODR, when we think of digital core projects or mediators employing negotiation support software to help parties, think about their interests, what their interests are, then all of these projects are really ODR projects, even though some of us may be saying these are traditional courts, just adding on a little bit of technology, and these are traditional mediators, just using some, technological tools that are now available. So after I've relaxed the online component, I'd like to examine the ADR factor in ODR. Are we merely transforming existing practices to another setting? And it seems to me that what we heard in the presentations demonstrate that the relationship between ADR and ODR is more complex than that, or should be more complex than that. I mean, on the one hand, our ODR systems obviously draw on the knowledge and experience gained in the ADR field, and they should do so, right? Because we are moving these systems or creating systems that were traditionally offline in the online setting, and some of these people, like Colin, actually came from the traditional ADR community. At the same time, however, emerging ODR systems and processes have also challenged some of the practices and assumptions that underlie traditional ADR processes. And I'd like to give you several examples. One example for the ways in which technology can upset some of the concepts and understandings developed in traditional ADR is in the realm of understanding disputes. What constitutes a dispute? How it evolves? At what stage can it be addressed? While traditional sociolegal scholarship has viewed the evolution of disputes as a multi-stage process, some of it actually taking place in the mind of the aggrieved, and I'm referring to Felsener and Abel and Sarah's piece, ODR presents a somewhat different picture. We increasingly realize that technology can assist us in automatically detecting problems, right? Potential disputes, well before the aggrieved parties are even aware of them, and addressing these disputes. And we saw that, we could see how it, we saw that in Ethan's presentation, and Salil wrote about it, with the bots on Wikipedia actually fixing Wikipedia pages before the other side even starts complaining about it and getting into an editing war. Another area in which this compound relationship between ADR and ODR can be evidenced is the area of dispute system design. And here I'm relating to some of what Colin said. Both eBay and Wikipedia seem to follow the principles elaborated by Uri, Brett, and Fisher in their important book on this topic that was published, I believe, in the late 80s, Getting Disputes Resolved. So their work, which actually comes out of extensive research in the U.S. mining industry, gives us basic principles for designing dispute resolution systems. And sort of the main idea is to start off any system with interest-based processes, negotiation, mediation, and then escalate to rights-based processes, but offer low-cost rights-based processes and allow parties to loop back into those interest-based processes, and obviously also do some dispute prevention. And we see that, this is really the shape of both eBay and Wikipedia's dispute resolution system. So at first blush, it seems that they really follow these principles and perhaps even model their systems after this and other writing in the field. However, a closer inspection reveals that while ODR draws on ADR terminology, concepts, and structures, it also substantially alters their meaning. So take, for example, the arbitration process described by Salil. The process bears little resemblance to the rights-based process that is familiar to us from the physical setting. In Wikipedia, arbitration is used, as we heard, not to decide what the truth is, what an article should contain, what is relevant, what really happened, right? But rather to judge user conduct. In addition, instead of the common single decision-maker model, we have a group of arbitrators deciding a case in bank, trying to reach decisions by way of consensus. Arbitration decisions, we hear, are made public and are freely available. In eBay, the emergence of automated negotiation has raised serious challenges to traditional distinctions between negotiation and mediation, with technology playing the role of a fourth party, as coined by Katch and Rifkin, sometimes even merging what we knew as the third party, the mediator, with technology. So, while Colin was representing the pessimistic side, it seems to me that while traditional ADR carried a promise, right, for flexibility, tailored systems, it is often ODR that realizes this opportunity, or maybe has more of a potential to realize this opportunity by generating fresh structures that are tailored to the particular context in which they are applied. And this reality really presents a serious challenge for traditional ADR, with its ready-made molds and patterns that it currently offers. I want to say just one more thing about the functions of ODR. What does it actually do? So it is by now, I think, commonplace that dispute resolution systems not only resolve disputes. The norm-generating function of these systems is particularly evident in certain group settings, right, in closed groups. A well-known example from the traditional ADR setting is the research conducted by Lisa Bernstein on the diamond industry, where she found that this industry actually has its own well-functioning arbitration system that has its own norms that are separate from state norms and successfully enforces these norms. The presentations we heard on Wikipedia and other collaborative frameworks show the potential, at least, for such systems to be in place. But certainly in the case of Wikipedia, we can see how these systems can actually help shape interactions among users, right? In particular, strangers who come from diverse backgrounds and need to collaborate. So in these contexts, the dispute resolution system is not merely reflective of the values and the culture of the environment into which it is introduced, but it is also constitutive in that it teaches its users to relate and interact in a different way with one another. But then the question arises, how does it teach them to interact? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Salil's answer is that it teaches them through the outcome of the arbitration decision. That is what guides them in future conduct. And I would like to suggest another possibility, maybe far-fetched, but one that I thought of. It may be that going through the dispute resolution process itself teaches them something about how they should behave, and not necessarily the ultimate outcome of the dispute. Having parties undergo collaborative ADR processes may actually prove to be a learning experience, one that teaches them how to interact with one another when they are collaborating, and thereby transforming the very fabric of social relations in these environments. So under this understanding, it may therefore make sense for the various arbitrators to collaborate and try to reach a consensus decision, a consensus-based decision, not only for reasons of legitimacy, but also as a way of modeling the means of interaction for decision-making on the site. By the same token, it may come as no surprise that eBay opted for automated negotiation, where it didn't have to model necessarily such interaction and could settle for the outcome. But I'm happy to think about this further. So one of the issues, I'd like to leave us sort of with a few questions hanging there. And the question is, can we draw broader lessons from these experiences? And I find myself asking, under what conditions might ODR actually, first of all, might ODR systems actually emerge? And then we want to ask, why haven't they emerged? Where are the disputes? Where are they going now? And then, where there are ODR systems, under what conditions can these systems actually facilitate a kind of deep change in the way parties interact and in the fabric of social relations on these sites? Is it imperative that the environment these systems are introduced into actually operate under a collaborative ideology? Should we be surprised if indeed these things do take place? Should we be surprised that these forms of engagement actually emerge online, what many traditional ADR people see as a form of engagement that is cold, distant, poor with data. So I hope we can start talking about these and other questions, and I'm really happy we still have time to open this up. Thank you. So I think, would any of the panelists like to quickly say something, or should we just open it up to questions and let people who have been waiting who should speak? So how about we open it up? Are there questions from the audience? Yes. Christine?
In reference to the eBay court system, do the jurors, when they're constituted as a body, at any point talk to each other, or are you just simply accumulating votes based on a single person sitting there reading the file?
Yeah, it's the latter. So the jurors don't communicate with each other. It goes to a jury of 21 in the eBay India case, but there's no reason why it couldn't be 50 or 100. But there's no opportunity for the jurors to communicate. We just aggregate the votes. But I think that the community court actually wasn't invoked explicitly during these conversations, but I think it was. I'm glad that we had an opportunity to present at the beginning of the meeting, because I do feel like it is a response to many of the dynamics that we've named here. I thought that your presentation was very, very interesting in pointing out that there isn't a lot of dispute resolution systems for a lot of these social organizations, social media companies, that are YouTube or Flickr or whatever the users are generating. But actually, we have a lot of interest from a lot of these social media companies to integrate community court. So we're in conversations with Facebook about doing exactly that. We've been in conversations with Craigslist and some other Yelp, which is another kind of review site. And it's an opportunity for the community to play this resolution role. And, I talked a little bit about sort of public policy and e-democracy. I think that this really is a way of democratizing dispute resolution in some of these environments. So the community court, I think, is an interesting response to some of the dynamics that were named in these presentations. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's a response.
So I think that there were very interesting things related to the role of the community, and I guess the function of ODR that Orna was looking for. Salil asked us whether the Wikipedia experience can replicate itself. And I think that the answer is in the experience itself. I mean, the reason that people were so dedicated to the process in Wikipedia was that they were engaged in the process. And I think that that is the reason I may disagree with what Colin was saying before, that we don't have any online communities. Maybe our national communities are more integrated into our identity, but it is not that easy to exit an online community, especially if you are engaged. It's never easy to exit an online community if it's a mega community like Wikipedia or eBay or Facebook, because of the network effect. But even in a small community where you are invested in a process like dispute resolution in Wikipedia, that's what makes you link to that community, and I think on the one hand, and on the other hand, that is the basis for the fairness and justice, or what Orna was calling before, the legitimacy that people are looking for. So I think that the process is the essence, actually, and it not only produces the norms, but also socialize the community, and therefore creates the basis for the legitimacy. And I think that I disagree with the description of Guy about the absence of dispute resolution. Maybe it's not communal dispute resolution, but there's dispute resolution, right? The platform would decide what's on the platform and what does not go on the platform, and what it allows, what it doesn't allow. That's a way of resolving a dispute, right? I want to put something on YouTube, and I can't. And that is an unfair, maybe unjust, maybe illegitimate, but that's a way to resolve a dispute between me and the platform. So I think that there are lots of dispute resolution mechanisms, And I think that there is a lot of negotiations that we see nowadays between the residents of these online communities on eBay, on YouTube, on Facebook, and the owners of the platforms relating to these rules, to these rules of behavior. And I think that this, creating these mechanisms would give these terms of use, the standard contracts, a lot more legitimacy, because it would keep the community in, and it would gain the legitimacy that they're looking for.
I'm Carrie Menkelmeadow. So I think one of my roles for the next 2 days as one of the founders of the original ADR movement is to raise questions about the tensions between ADR and ODR. So my comments are going to pick up a lot on what you were talking about. So you'll hear more from me tomorrow, but I'm a face-to-face ADR person. And my challenge or my question to the panel is, as Orna was outlining some of the goals of ODR versus ADR, I just want to remind everybody that two of the major goals of ADR was to provide, as you said, flexibility and tailoring of both processes and remedies. And what we see up here in a lot of instances is through volume processing of disputes, less tailoring, less flexibility, rote remedies, same kinds of remedies, or the bidding process, very simplistic allocation through monetary or quantitative terms. So that's, any one of you want to pick up on that. To the extent that ADR promises flexibility and tailoring, to what extent does ODR reduce that? I think it does, but I'm happy to engage with you. And secondly, one of the major promises of traditional ADR was to promise confidentiality to the parties, so that they could honestly share their innermost, deepest, most interests in a confidential private setting where nobody else would have access to it. And the medical records thing is an issue I've been following in the States, too, very problematic. But even picking up on the computerized information management thing, which as an arbitrator, as a user, as an arbitrator, I value. Obviously, it decreases cost in arbitration. I am an international arbitrator. The other side of it is that cases may now be available. Now, the part of me that believes in public justice and everyone having the right to see outcomes values that. The lawyer in me, who might represent parties who choose arbitration because they want private dispute resolution systems, gets nervous when she sees that outcomes and cases may now be available in databases and reports, as we heard, and sources in dispute systems that promised the parties confidentiality in use. So I don't know whether anybody wants to comment. I mean, more issues. I just here highlight flexibility, tailoring, and confidentiality is at least two things that old ADR promised that I worry a little bit about getting lost in ODR.
If I can talk just really briefly about those, I think that I don't know as much about actual real-world ADR, but from what I understand, I think that it couldn't be more different in some respects on those 2 points than the Wikipedia system. I mean, even though many of the same people might work in international ADR, right? You have panels drawn from often very large rosters, so you don't always have the same 12 people, right, dealing with something. And I think that with the Wikipedia example will tend to reinforce this routine or this kind of pigeonholing of cases. And then the privacy, I mean, except for the fact that these people have these anonymous handles, I mean, otherwise it's completely displayed for years. So I think you're right to think that this is like through the looking glass on these 2 points.
Well, I guess I disagree with both of you. I don't think this is working, though. Is it working? And it's a very interesting set of questions, though. I mean, how do we even conceptualize flexibility or tailoring to an individual? Alternative dispute resolution typically categorizes the forms of dispute resolution as mediation, arbitration, and negotiation. I think ODR doesn't have to accept any of those. Those are different ways of using information, basically. ODR has the potential. So I think it's certainly arguable. Your case is arguable if you're talking about ODR today. But ODR in the future, when there will be a whole array of capabilities for using information that are not available today, and that are options that are not available when meeting face-to-face, we'll have a new kind of flexibility, or a different kind of flexibility, and certainly a different kind of tailoring to an individual. Really what I want as an individual is redress. If I have a problem with my credit bureau, I want a way to deal with that. Now, I think there certainly is an intriguing question about whether these are disputes or issues or problems or something. In the electronic medical records area, the tradition is if it's a minor problem, it's settled in between the patient has a minor problem, disagreement, settles it informally with the doctor. Patient has a major problem, sues for malpractice. What about all the stuff in between? Well, I think the electronic medical records are going to reveal all the stuff in between. And that's where we need fair, flexible, responsive responses to these problems. Are they disputes? Maybe that's a bad, just an inappropriate. It's a word that has outlived its usefulness. As far as confidentiality goes, the whole society is reorienting its way of looking at what information is revealed and what's not revealed. The question that used to be asked about confidentiality is, if I have an online mediation in which information is flowing over the network, how can I guarantee confidentiality? We haven't had any problems with that. Colin has 40 million disputes a year. I don't know if anybody ever raises that issue anymore about confidentiality. The fact that arbitration decisions may be online, yeah, I think there are pressures to put all kinds of data online. That's again, one of the waves of technology we're experiencing, because these things can be put online. The ICANN, the domain name disputes, are online, but were not put on. It took us probably 6 or 7 years before they were put online in a usable way. Now those are, I don't want to get into that now because you'll hear more about those disputes later. Arbitrators say those aren't even arbitrations. There's something else because they're not enforced in court, but essentially they are arbitrations. They're online. There's no precedential value in the decision, but consistency, information is online, striving for consistency, there's almost an inevitable outcome there.
Well, as the person who I think created this contrast between ODR and ADR in my presentation, let me begin by knocking it down. I believe that, I have a good friend in the ADR field who has said to me repeatedly, all you have to do is squint a little bit, and it's very hard to tell the difference between ODR and ADR. And a lot of people who are in the ADR field are using technology in their practices, or using email and faxes and track changes and all those sorts of things. They don't even think twice about it. So there is a merger that's happening there. And at least in looking back at the origins of the ODR field, it was very explicit that this was a clear outgrowth of ADR. And we were just trying to use technology to make ADR work better. That was that was our mission at the beginning. And then over time, we've learned that there are some things you can do online, you can't do offline. And you're not going to find anybody, I think, in the ODR field who says, oh, we should do online in lieu of face-to-face. I think now there's a clear understanding that there's a spectrum between both, and we embrace these hybrids and all those sorts of things. But I guess the longer-term argument that I would make is I sort of agree with both of you. I think both of the points that Carrie raises, I think, at its best, both ADR and ODR can deliver confidentiality and flexibility. Now, there are many implementations out there that do neither of those things. I think both in the face-to-face world and in the online world. I do think that the reliance on code and the fourth party that Ethan and Jana came up with does create systems that, in a sense, are a little less flexible than when you're sitting in a room with a dynamic mediator that can work with you and change the process, on the fly. But at the same time, there are huge advantages that can be gained from, using technology in that way as well. So, I guess when I raise the issues, the challenges the ADR field is facing, I think they exist for the ODR field as well. And I guess what I wanted to do, I know that I think Orna said in her presentation that she sort of saw me as representing the pessimistic perspective on some of this. But I do think I fundamentally am an optimist in that we can achieve the goals of both the ADR field and the ODR field by using these tools. And I guess what I wanted to do is sort of urge us to tackle them more proactively so that we can deliver on what we wanted to achieve in both of these disciplines as opposed to kind of where we are currently in practice.
I think your points are very well taken, and I think they point to certain limits. I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves, are these limits constant or are they shifting? And we sort of need to reflect on that once in a while. Certainly there are disputes where you would not want to have them online. You wouldn't want to have the resolution posted online. But I think we have also, and I connect myself to both worlds. And I think in my hat as a traditional mediator, we have become accustomed to this, blanket confidentiality, always having the same level, quite a broad level of confidentiality, and have not revisited that notion and sort of how we look at confidentiality offline as well. So I think that's it for me, and I'm happy to open it for more. I see Nancy.
Well, I can just talk loud. I have to say, well, first thing I'd say is the community court has only resolved, 1,200 disputes, and the principles of online dispute resolution at eBay have resolved hundreds of millions. So I don't want to put the cart ahead of the horse in terms of saying, oh, the community court is the future, let's all jump on board. There's certainly a lot of challenges that we need to wrestle with, and one of those is what are the objectives for decision, what should be the qualifications of juries, how should we design these systems for different types of disputes that we wrestle with. So the reason why I'm so excited about it is because it is new and we've got to figure those things out, whereas a lot of the assisted negotiation things we've been talking about are much more well-trod areas in the eBay context.
But I guess maybe that is what I'm saying. Is in the ODR field, we should think beyond the constraints of our traditional definitions. And I think the community court is an opportunity maybe for us to think about the court example. And why is it that this judicial model has proven so pervasive in the minds of people around the world? I think, at least in my early days in the dispute resolution field, ADR was defined as really counter to that judicial model. And I guess maybe the community court is my experimentation, in a sense, with embracing some of those models and taking on some of those challenges. I'm not saying that anything's a panacea. I mean, I think one of the tenets of dispute resolution has always been, let's have a broad toolbox and let's design systems dynamically based on the types of issues that are coming in. So I don't want to be doctrinaire about any of this. I guess what I want to say is let 1,000 flowers bloom and let's see what works and what doesn't. So if anybody's interested in the community court example, please come to the afternoon session, because literally we are in the process of figuring out how this is going to work. And, I think just like the ADR to ODR example, where we learned that some things worked well and some things didn't work well, I think the community court, we're going to have the same learning curve that we need to clamber up. And I don't know if we're ever going to get to hundreds of millions of disputes through it, but, it's definitely an interesting thought puzzle.
Jeff?
Jeff Goreski. The one thing I would go back to is this issue of calling this field dispute resolution. As a lawyer, this really should be more about building relationships and avoiding disputes. And the use of online in a global setting, you just got rid of the lawyers and started focusing on a global environment rather than all these laws that seem to create obstacles. Online opens up a community set of relationships and really creates opportunities to build. That's where I think the opportunity is more in communication rather than just saying, let's take the traditional legal system and port it over in an online environment. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work in eBay, doesn't work in Facebook, doesn't work in Wikipedia. If the courts ever thought they were going to get into those cases, or even ADR for that matter, for more.
I think again that this is an extremely interesting debate, and I would just like to add that because we are speaking about online dispute resolution, it is mostly or usually also cross-border, and it will be more and more cross-border, and also it will deal with multiple languages. And this also puts the discussion about flexibility and tailoring in a new perspective, and we need to think of flexibility and tailoring in the multilingual environment.
The issue of maybe beyond multilingualism of culture is kind of hinted, I think, by Salil when he mentioned that they only dealt with the English Wikipedia dispute resolution system, and I thought it would be fascinating to look at the other, Wikipedia languages and cultures and see if we can find differences. And I think from that, I'd like to take it to another point. I was asking myself as we were talking here, to what extent can we actually examine one process that takes, when Salil also was talking about the arbitration, and so much is happening outside the arbitration, and in other contexts as well. On the one hand, it's debilitating because it's very hard to examine the entire spectrum of what's going on a site like Wikipedia. But on the other, it does probably skew some of the conclusions we get at when we look at part of that, and that's certainly true with respect to the more global. We have a mic? Oh, okay. Any other questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask about enforcement. I mean, when we're talking about Wikipedia, when we're talking about eBay, what happens if someone, just goes away with the money? How then?
With Wikipedia, part of what was going on, and this is where I think Orna's point is well taken in terms of there's a lot of moving parts. Part of what's going on is that the arbitrators are actually sending a signal to the administrators about what actions they can and can't take, either in that specific case or generally, right? And so, they actually hunt those people and sort of figure out who's created, and that's why you get these sock puppet bans, the idea that you're pretending to be someone else. So you can, but they're actually fairly sophisticated at tracking that or figuring that out. both through human sort of means as well as technologically.
Yeah, the fluidity of identity makes enforcement a big challenge, but that's something that big companies like eBay and PayPal have invested in an inordinate amount of resources to tackle. And we have a lot of very sneaky ways. I can't tell you what we do because I'd have to kill you all, but there are a lot of very technologically advanced ways that we can hunt down that problem. Now, but I think you put your finger on a key issue. And I mentioned this before. I think I did it very briefly in the first 15-minute presentation. In my experience, enforcement is crucial to online dispute resolution. And if you look at all the successful ODR schemes, they have had built-in enforcement. If you look at ICANN, ICANN owns the database. When they decide who owns the domain name, they flip a switch, they have just enforced it. At eBay and PayPal, we move the money. That is why eBay paid billions of dollars for PayPal, because you cannot have a redress process unless you have the ability to get the money and then give it back to the other side. Without that ability, you're all just whistling Dixie. And I think, it's a lot of interesting questions about why does Wikipedia throw people off the site? Because they can. That's one of the few things they can do. If they could charge you $100, they would. But they don't have that ability. So you're going to use the tools at your disposal in order to execute your outcomes. And I think that's a very interesting point when you look at some of these other social media sites. What power does Facebook have over its users? Well, I don't know. Some pretty scary powers. That would make people pretty paranoid about what Facebook would do with all of that intimate information. So I think that the enforcement question is crucial. And this makes me think of one other point that came up both from Orna's commentary and also from a couple people in the audience. I think that, and again, I share this, so please don't take this criticism as being me pointing a finger, because I'll point it right back at me. What? If I point, this is a dispute resolution thing. If I'm pointing at you, 3 fingers are pointing back at me. So, one of the things that we want is that we want dispute resolution systems to be, in some senses, educative or ennobling or create more of a community. And I do think that there is an element of these systems that, with Wikipedia, when there is a resolution process, it does underscore the trust in the community, and that makes people feel more loyalty towards it. But I must point out that these processes are not the value proposition for these sites. Nobody comes to Wikipedia because they want to participate in the dispute resolution process. No one at eBay is spending their endless hours clicking through listings because they hope they get a dispute so they can use my process. No, they want to collect humble figurines. There is a positive aspect, and the dispute resolution process normally is interpreted as something that is an unfortunate necessity. So I think that we shouldn't put on rose-colored glasses and think that these things are, somehow ennobling for these communities. Most of the time, they're necessary, but I've said before, it's kind of like the dentist's office. Nobody gets excited about the dentist's office on a daily basis, but if you have a toothache, all you can think about is the dentist's office. So that's what dispute resolution is in these communities. It's necessary, but it's not part of the value proposition.
About eBay, what percentage of dispute resolution doesn't end up getting really resolved? And then in general, what is eBay's responsibility or liability, if at all?
Well, there's a couple different good questions in there. eBay has different dispute resolution mechanisms that act kind of like a filter, like I talked about. So pretty much every dispute gets resolved. The question is, at what point does it get resolved? eBay wants these disputes to be resolved as early as possible, preferably before they're even a dispute. But if you can engage in direct negotiation between the parties, you can resolve a certain percentage of disputes. If you get through all of that direct negotiation and you get the tracking information and the partial refund bidding and everything that we do on the process and it's escalated to a claim where the users ask eBay or PayPal to decide it, which usually only represents about 10% of incoming volume, then we render a decision. And that decision is binding under our user agreement. Now, of course, you can always sue. You can always go to the courts. There's nothing in the user agreement that blocks you from pursuing that channel. But the interesting thing about these communities, even with the hundreds of millions of disputes that we've done, it is a tiny, tiny percentage of cases that ever get appealed outside of the redress mechanisms that we provide. So I think these dispute resolution mechanisms have proven pretty effective. But again, that might also have to do with the fact the average transaction value is about $100. So there's not a lot of incentive for people to go sue unless they've really got an axe they want to grind. So we've proven the effectiveness of these mechanisms. But the question, and I think this gets back to the core issue that I had, is that buyers go through this process and say, you know what, I'd rather just go to a site where I win every time, and hey, I'm not happy. Great, here's your money back. Keep the item. That's not fair. That's not a just outcome. But a lot of buyers would rather be given an unjust outcome as long as it's in their benefit. And that's another truth that we need to wrestle with in terms of building these systems.
With regard to both Wikipedia and eBay, the credibility of the person within the dispute for the future is really relevant. Or there are different kinds of disputes, and I assume that no one would really think that someone would take someone else to court on a dispute of $50 or $100. So it's not the court that is, or the cost of the dispute that moving people forward to those of the online court. So it's credibility, but what about other costs of credibility? I mean, there is no credibility issue here. It's not a topic.
Well, I think that this is, it's interesting. They have their own sort of reputation with their username. It's not the same kind of reputation that it cannot be translated into, as you say, $100. So there is, to some extent, there is that, and so there's a potential that they're trying to vindicate some sort of harm to their dignity. And that is I think that is a source of a lot of the complaints that they get, is someone feels that they've been wronged in this way. And so, in a way, maybe it is an atypical dispute resolution system in the sense that it's really dealing with non-pecuniary conflict, right? And trying to deal with it and channel it or deal with the person who cannot be rehabilitated. So, if that helps.
Okay. I want to quick. Okay, Marta.
You mentioned in your presentation a key concept of the next week of ODR, which was crowdsourced solutions. Can you just expand a little bit more on that? Because I'm using notes the same word in my presentation, and I just check about the meaning of this.
What did I mean by that?
Yeah.
So crowdsourcing, I think, in a Silicon Valley context, I'm not sure if it has a dictionary definition that's different than this, but it's taking a complicated problem and splitting it into 1,000 pieces or even 1,000,000 pieces maybe, and then having lots of people do a relatively simple thing, and then re-aggregating all those contributions back into a relatively sophisticated solution. So crowdsourcing, there's been a couple examples of websites that do this. And I think the community court is another example of using this principle of crowdsourcing to tackle dispute resolution challenges. But I think one of the reasons why I'm drawn to crowdsourcing is because I do think it's connected to these notions of e-democracy and public participation. So, when we were talking about all these websites that don't have dispute resolution mechanisms, they don't want to decide these disputes. None of these big technology websites, the only reason they do so is because they're forced to do so due to liability concerns and because of community credibility. But if they had a mechanism where turnkey almost, they could say, look, have the community resolve these issues in a way that does not reflect on us as the community administrator, I think they do it in 2 seconds. And I think that long term, it creates more of an institution, institutional expectation that is in line with where we want to head. Now, it also undermines this notion of the dispute resolver as a professional, as someone with a unique set of skills, and it's almost using mass people to play a role that we used to say, well, let's hire professionals who receive this training and have this expertise to do it. So, I think that that's something we need to resolve, but hopefully that's in line with the way that you're planning on using it.
Okay, I'm going to use my prerogative and say one last word and then a few messages and then we're off to lunch. One last thought I'm sort of left with, and I think it picks up on the flexibility point, is maybe we're asking a question also about what makes dispute resolution systems evolve, whether they're online or offline, and what makes them sort of stagnate or remain fixed. And I think it's interesting to know, I think, Salil, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your paper, you write it's been very difficult to actually change the Wikipedia system. It's kind of stuck, right, where it is. Whereas eBay has been, really innovative and changing. And these are some of the questions I'm asking myself. And, when we look at ADR in the institutionalized setting, the law has had this co-opting effect where it kind of reduced ADR to one form. So just a thought to be left with. And some messages. We're off to lunch right now. During lunch, we'll have a technology display inside the room. Lunch is set out outside, I believe, or if I'm correct, we'll know that in a second. We'll walk together. The rest of the conference today is in another area. We'll walk there together a little bit after 2. And we actually have 2 sets of concurrent panels. So we're only going to reconvene for dinner, which will leave here at around 6 or 6:30, right after we finish, to a beautiful Druze village, Daliat el Carmel. The good news is we're going to be there, and it's going to be an exciting local experience. The one caveat I need to mention is we're going to respect the family we're being hosted by, and we're not going to have alcohol served there. So if anyone is very eager to have alcohol, you can have it before or after, but not there. And hopefully we'll get a chance to see the market there. Enjoy lunch. Bye.